A woman trapped in a tower, but is she prisoner or bait? Welcome to Crimson Whisper. I am your host Bramwell. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I value every word. Now, the mystery begins. It was a murky autumn evening in London, the sort of evening where the mist clung to the cobblestones and the gas lamps flickered against the oppressive darkness. A light drizzle had started, and the streets seemed to be swallowed by the thick fog, turning the once familiar paths into shadowy corridors of uncertainty. I sat in my usual place in our Baker Street apartment, looking over a few reports from Scotland Yard, while Holmes, as always, was deep in thought, his keen mind tirelessly at work. "Watson," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through the otherwise quiet atmosphere, "have you heard about the lady in the tower?" I looked up from my papers, startled by the abruptness of his question. "No, Holmes. What's this about?" He paused, pushing his chair back and turning to face me, his sharp eyes gleaming with the excitement of an enigma to be unraveled. "A lady, as it happens, has vanished without a trace from her locked room in the Tower of London." "It's a most peculiar case indeed," I raised an eyebrow. "The Tower of London. I assume Scotland Yard has already been involved, but why hasn't there been any word of it in the papers?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice tinged with the satisfaction of having already grasped the crux of the mystery. "The authorities are baffled. The Lady Catherine Montague, an aristocrat of some repute, was last seen in her chamber in the tower, with no way of leaving, yet she is gone. The door was locked from the inside, and the guards posted outside heard nothing. It is as if she simply evaporated into the air." He paused, and I watched as his fingers steepled together, a gesture I had come to associate with his deep concentration. But something does not add up. It is too neat, too clean, almost as though the very elements of this disappearance are tailored to mislead. Before I could speak, there came a knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter, addressed in the fine hand of a noblewoman. Holmes opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. He looked up, a rare expression of amusement crossing his face. "This is precisely the sort of invitation I needed, Watson," he said, his tone almost playful. "It seems our Lady Montague's family has reached out to us. They request my presence at the tower immediately, with promises of a generous reward for anyone capable of solving the mystery of her disappearance." I rose, already gathering my coat. "It seems you have a new puzzle on your hands. Shall we go then?" With a swift nod, Holmes rose and grabbed his deerstalker hat. "Indeed, Watson. Let us go and see if the locked room holds more than mere illusion." The carriage ride to the Tower of London was a quiet one, the muffled sound of the wheels on the wet roads the only accompaniment to my thoughts. Holmes had already begun to assess the situation in his mind, his face set in that characteristic mask of thought. I was content to let him work through the problem on his own, knowing that once again we were about to be drawn into a web of intricacy that only he could untangle. The tower loomed before us, its ancient stone walls weathered by centuries of history. The guards stood at attention as we approached, their stern faces betraying no sign of the disturbance that had recently gripped the place. Holmes wasted no time in addressing the officer in charge, a Captain Aldridge, who looked no less than befuddled by the circumstances. "Mr. Holmes, I trust you are here to assist?" the captain asked, his tone a mixture of respect and desperation. "I am indeed, Captain," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "Now show us the scene of this baffling disappearance." The interior of the tower was even more imposing than the exterior, the ancient stone corridors thick with the smell of damp and history. We were led to the room where Lady Catherine Montague had last been seen, her chambers, situated in one of the older towers of the fortress, its walls lined with tapestries and ornate furniture. The door was locked, just as Holmes had been told, and there were no signs of forced entry. A solitary candle had been extinguished in the corner, and the bed, though unmade, appeared undisturbed, save for the faint imprint of a figure lying in it. On the floor beside the bed, there was a faint trail of dust, as though someone had moved quickly through the room, their footsteps hastily erased. Holmes knelt to inspect the floor, his eyes narrowing as he ran his fingers over the smooth surface. He looked up at the captain, his expression inscrutable. "Tell me, Captain, was Lady Montague prone to sleepwalking?" Captain Aldridge seemed momentarily taken aback. "No, sir. She was known to be a very sound sleeper, Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already whirring with possibilities. He turned to the window which had been left ajar, the cold wind blowing in. And yet there is this. If I were to hazard a guess, the key to this mystery lies within these walls, Captain. But we must take a closer look. As I observed Holmes, I could not help but wonder what he was already seeing that I could not. The clues were faint, the evidence inconclusive. But I knew that by the end of this case, Holmes would have unravelled the layers of deception, exposing the truth hidden behind Lady Montague's vanishing act. And so we waited, poised for the next move in this perplexing case. Holmes stood at the window for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the darkened courtyard below. The candle flickered once more, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the room. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. He was already piecing together the scant clues, and though I could not yet see the path he was following, I had learned to trust his mind's ability to weave connections from the most unlikely of sources. "You see, Watson," Holmes said, finally breaking his silence, his voice soft but purposeful, "this room holds secrets not readily apparent to the casual observer." I stepped closer, keen to follow his reasoning. His fingers brushed against the window frame, inspecting the delicate latch with a precision that could only be described as practiced. "Notice this, Watson. The window is not merely ajar. It is designed to open with the utmost care, as though it had been opened many times before." I looked at him, confused. "But Captain Aldridge assured us that no one entered the room through the window." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That is exactly the point. The window has been disturbed, yet the guards have not seen anyone approach. If Lady Montague truly vanished from this room, the window could be the key to understanding how." He turned, his eyes sharp with insight. "The question is, why leave the window open at all? If someone was attempting to escape unnoticed, they would have closed it immediately after making their exit." I glanced at the captain, who stood just beyond the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a breach in security. "It's possible someone entered the room then?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the bed, his gaze following the faint trail of dust I had noticed earlier. He crouched beside it and examined the floor closely, then stood, his face suddenly hardening with a realization. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "But not in the way we might think. You see, Watson, this room has been cleverly set up to mislead us. The trail of dust, the condition of the window, it all speaks of a well-executed illusion. No one entered, and no one left through the window. The lady's disappearance was far more methodical. I was beginning to understand, but my mind was not yet sharp enough to keep up with his pace. What exactly are you suggesting, Holmes?" "That Lady Montague's disappearance was staged." "Aye, Watson," he said with a nod, his voice steady. "This is no ordinary disappearance. Someone inside this very room staged her vanishing with the utmost care, leaving us with clues that are simply too neat, too perfect." I could see the gears in his mind turning, the mystery unfolding before him, though it remained unclear to me. But why would anyone do this? Why would anyone want to make it appear that she vanished? Holmes rose and turned to face the captain. "Captain Aldridge, tell me, was Lady Montague expecting anyone the night she disappeared?" The captain looked uncomfortable, as though he had already given all the answers he knew. "She was not expecting anyone. She kept to herself in her chambers, as she always did." "There were no scheduled visitors." "No scheduled visitors," Holmes repeated, his voice low as he considered the implications. "Yet someone had access to this room. Someone knew exactly where to find her, and how to make her disappearance appear credible." I could sense a sudden shift in the air, as though a vital piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place, though the nature of it remained elusive. Holmes's next words would surely illuminate the mystery further. "Captain," Holmes continued, his tone now full of authority, "I believe we are dealing with someone who is both very close to Lady Montague and very familiar with her routine. This was no random intrusion. It was planned, it was controlled, and it was executed with precision." As Holmes spoke, I could almost hear the clicks in his mind, each word bringing him closer to the truth. But why go to such lengths? If Lady Montague was in some sort of danger, why leave behind such an elaborate scene? Why not simply take her away? Holmes paused, looking at me with a faint smile, his eyes glimmering with the satisfaction of a theory forming. "The answer lies in the very nature of the crime, Watson. What better way to hide the true intentions of a criminal than to create a spectacle? one that is so confusing and so expertly executed that no one would dare to question its authenticity. His gaze swept over the room, lingering on the bed, the window, and finally resting on the door. This was not a case of kidnapping or murder, Watson. No, this was something more insidious. Someone wanted us to think that Lady Montague had vanished, but in truth she has been hidden in plain sight. The real question is, who in this very tower could have staged such a crime and why? Before I could respond, a sharp knock came at the door, interrupting our train of thought. Captain Aldridge's expression was grim as he entered, holding a letter sealed with a crimson wax emblem. "What is it, Captain?" Holmes asked, his curiosity piqued. "It's a note for you, Mr. Holmes," Captain Aldridge said, extending the letter with a hesitant hand. "It was delivered to us just moments ago. It appears to be addressed to you personally." Holmes took the letter with a quiet nod and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, then returned to the captain. Well, it seems our mystery has taken an interesting turn," Holmes said, a faint glint of amusement in his voice. "Captain Aldridge, I believe we have been invited to the very heart of this puzzle." I leaned in, eager to hear more, but before Holmes could elaborate, the captain spoke again, his voice edged with urgency. "The message, Mr. Holmes," the captain pressed. Holmes looked up from the letter, his expression more serious now. "It's an invitation, Captain. An invitation to meet with someone who knows far more than they're letting on about Lady Montague's disappearance." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. "I believe our next step is clear. We must follow the trail wherever it leads, though I am certain it will not be an easy path." With that, Holmes turned toward the door and I followed, eager for whatever revelations lay ahead, though I knew that the shadows of deception were only just beginning to unfold. The invitation in Holmes's pocket felt heavy with unspoken implications. As we made our way through the tower's winding corridors, I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down upon us. The sounds of our footsteps echoed, soft and deliberate, as if the ancient stone walls themselves were holding their breath, awaiting the next development. Holmes, ever the enigma, walked ahead, his pace unhurried but purposeful, his mind already several steps ahead. As we passed the guards, I noticed their eyes following us, perhaps with more curiosity than suspicion, but there was no question that the atmosphere in the tower had shifted. What had once been a fortress of history and royalty was now a house of secrets, its walls holding far more than they let on. Holmes did not pause, but I could sense the anticipation in him. He had that familiar glint in his eyes, the one that indicated the unraveling of a particularly intricate knot. The captain led us to a smaller, more isolated wing of the tower, one that was not often visited by the public. It was here, away from the prying eyes of other officials, that Holmes would meet the mysterious figure who had sent the letter. We arrived at a simple wooden door, unmarked save for the faint outline of a symbol in the shape of a crescent moon. A curious detail, but one that Holmes seemed to take in without comment. Without a word, Captain Aldridge knocked twice and we waited, the silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a woman dressed in dark, somber clothing. She looked out from behind the door with an air of quiet resolve, her eyes sharp and calculating, though there was an undeniable hint of fear in them. Her face was pale, as though she had not seen the light of day in some time, and her fingers trembled slightly as she extended her hand to Holmes. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" Her voice was soft but steady, betraying a practiced composure that did little to mask the tension radiating from her. "I am," Holmes replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "And you are the person who sent the letter?" The woman nodded, her expression remaining unreadable. "My name is Helena Montague, Lady Catherine's sister. I need your help, Mr. Holmes. There is much more to this situation than the authorities realize, and I fear the truth will never come to light unless you intervene." Holmes's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something akin to interest in his eyes. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low, measured. She glanced over her shoulder as though checking for someone or something. Then, stepping aside, she motioned for us to enter. The room was dimly lit, with only a single candle flickering on a wooden table. On the walls hung tapestries that seemed to belong to a different time, their faded colors muted by age. It was a room meant to hide secrets, its very atmosphere suffused with a sense of quiet despair. Once we were seated, Lady Helena's hands clasped tightly in her lap, she began, her voice growing more urgent with each word. Catherine was not merely a prisoner in the tower, Mr. Holmes, she said. Her disappearance was no accident, no random act of violence. She had been investigating something she believed was hidden within the tower itself. She had been receiving anonymous letters for weeks, cryptic messages that warned her to stop her inquiries, to stay away from the inner chambers of the tower. But Catherine, she faltered for a moment, her eyes closing in grief. She would not be deterred. Holmes leaned forward, his attention entirely fixed on her. What was she investigating, Lady Helena? Helena hesitated. I don't know, but I suspect it had to do with something her late father had been involved in before his death. Something that was locked away in the deepest parts of the tower. I fear it was these secrets that led to her disappearance. There are forces at work here, Mr. Holmes, and I don't believe they are human. I looked at her, startled by her words. Forces at work? What do you mean? Lady Helena's face hardened, and she met my gaze with a strange intensity. My sister was close to uncovering something that would have shaken the very foundations of the crown itself. If she found what she was looking for, it could mean the end of many powerful people. Those people have been watching us for months. I fear they had no choice but to silence Catherine before she revealed the truth. Holmes sat back, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on his chin. And you believe she is still alive? His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that indicated his mind was racing through possibilities. I do, Lady Helena replied firmly. I believe she has been hidden away somewhere within the tower. The question is where and by whom? Holmes turned to Captain Aldridge, who had been standing by silently, observing the exchange. Captain, tell me, are there any places within the tower that are off limits even to the highest-ranking officials? The captain hesitated, then nodded. There are several areas that are not accessible to most people, Mr. Holmes. Some of them are sealed off for security reasons. Others are simply too old. The royal family has always maintained strict control over what is kept within the tower's walls. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then it is there in those hidden places that we must look. The key to Lady Montague's disappearance lies in those forbidden chambers. He stood, his posture shifting from thoughtful contemplation to one of quiet determination. We have our work cut out for us, Watson. There is a hidden story here, one that has remained concealed for centuries, but I am certain that we are close to unraveling it. As we left the room and made our way deeper into the tower's maze-like corridors, the weight of our task settled heavily upon me. There was much more at play here than I had initially suspected, and Holmes, as always, was several steps ahead. The path was growing darker, but I knew that if anyone could pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the lady in the tower, it was Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes. As we left the room and made our way deeper into the tower's maze-like corridors, the weight of our task settled heavily upon me. There was much more at play here than I had initially suspected, and Holmes, as always, was several steps ahead. The path was growing darker, but I knew that if anyone could pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the lady in the tower, it was Sherlock Holmes. The corridors of the tower seemed to stretch endlessly before us, each turn we made taking us deeper into the fortress's heart. The air was thick with the scent of ancient stone and dampness, the echo of our footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Holmes, ever composed, walked ahead with purpose, his mind no doubt racing through the numerous possibilities and contingencies that seemed to spring from every new piece of information. On the other hand, felt the weight of the mystery settling more heavily with each passing moment. What had Lady Catherine Montague been so close to uncovering? And what was it that had forced her into hiding, or worse, into silence? The more Helena Montague had spoken, the more I had been struck by the chilling notion that this case was no ordinary disappearance. It was a carefully orchestrated game, one in which every player seemed to be operating with their own hidden agenda. Holmes, I said, unable to keep the question from my lips, do you think Lady Helena was being entirely forthright with us? Holmes did not look back, but his voice was steady as ever. In matters of such import, Watson, no one can be entirely forthright. We all have our secrets, some more carefully guarded than others, but Lady Helena's words held truth. I sense no malice in her. Her concern for her sister seems genuine. The rest, however, that remains to be seen. We reached a heavy iron door at the end of a narrow corridor, its surface marked with strange engravings, symbols that seemed more like ancient warnings than decorative flourishes. Captain Aldridge stood back, his face tense as he nodded to Holmes. "This is the entryway to the deeper parts of the tower, Mr. Holmes. Only authorized personnel are allowed beyond this point. There are records, but they are limited. No one has entered here in decades." Holmes approached the door with his usual deliberate pace, studying the engravings with a quiet intensity. His fingers brushed over the carvings, a subtle frown on his face as he traced the symbols. I had seen him do this countless times, paying attention to details that most would overlook, finding significance in the minutiae that others dismissed. "What is this, Holmes?" I asked, my voice low as if the very air around us demanded silence. "These symbols," Holmes said, his voice almost a whisper, "are not just decorative. They are part of a coded system, likely a warning of some kind. And I believe they are meant to deter anyone from seeking what lies beyond this door." Captain Aldridge stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes, this is beyond my clearance. If you intend to go further, I must insist." But Holmes raised his hand, signaling for the captain to stop. "If there is to be a solution to this case, Captain, we must go forward. Whatever lies behind this door is integral to understanding Lady Montague's disappearance. I have no doubt that it is the final piece of the puzzle." The captain hesitated, but nodded in agreement, stepping aside. Holmes turned back to me, his gaze sharp and resolute. "Ready, Watson?" I swallowed, nodding in response, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something far darker than I had anticipated. With a sharp creak, the door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit passageway that sloped downward. The walls were cold to the touch, slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the musty scent of long-forgotten places. A single flickering torch cast eerie shadows along the stone, its light barely reaching the far corners of the tunnel. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his silhouette a stark contrast to the gloom that surrounded us. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest as the oppressive silence pressed down on us from all sides. It felt as though we were walking through the remnants of history, descending into a place where time itself had forgotten to tread. We moved deeper into the tunnel, the walls growing narrower and the air heavier with each step. The torchlight wavered, casting strange, dancing shapes on the walls, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few moments, as though expecting someone or something to be following us. Holmes, of course, paid none of it any mind. His attention was fixed entirely on the path ahead. At the end of the tunnel, the stone floor widened into a small circular chamber. It was bare save for an old wooden chest in the center of the room. The chest appeared ancient, its surface weathered by years of neglect. Strange markings adorned its sides, much like the ones we had seen earlier on the door. Holmes knelt beside the chest, his fingers brushing over the surface, his brow furrowing in concentration. "This is it, Watson," he said, his voice almost reverent. "This is what Lady Montague was searching for." He stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on the chest. "But why hide it here? What is it that lies within?" I could only watch in silence as Holmes reached for the latch, his hand steady as he undid the lock. The sound of the metal scraping against the wood echoed through the chamber, and with a sharp breath Holmes lifted the lid. Inside, there were papers, hundreds of them, scattered haphazardly across the bottom of the chest. They were yellowed with age, their edges curling, and the ink upon them faded. Holmes's eyes scanned the papers with remarkable speed, his fingers flipping through them, picking out fragments of sentences and passages as though they were pieces of a much larger puzzle. "These," he said, holding up a particularly worn sheet of parchment, "are records, documents detailing transactions, coded messages and references to a secret society. And there is more." He paused, his face growing more serious as he uncovered a second object from the chest, an old, tarnished key, its shape intricate and unmistakable. "This," Holmes muttered, his voice low with realization, "is the key to the final part of this mystery, Watson. And it is the key that will bring us closer to understanding what happened to Lady Montague. But it also tells us something far more troubling." I could feel the tension in the room tightening, the weight of the secrets within the chest pressing down on us both. Whatever this key unlocked, whatever it led to, it was something far greater and far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. Holmes stood in silence, the key clasped firmly between his fingers, as he studied it with an intensity that seemed to absorb every inch of the room's dim light. The tarnished metal glinted faintly, its shape intricate and old, yet unmistakably crafted for a purpose beyond simple locking mechanisms. It was a key to something hidden, something important, and in the quiet of that stone chamber it felt as though it could open a door to secrets long buried. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked quietly, though I knew from the way his eyes narrowed and his lips pressed together that he was already piecing together its significance. He didn't answer immediately. His mind was elsewhere, no doubt unraveling a complex web of connections I could not yet see. Finally he looked up, his face a mask of quiet determination. "This key, Watson," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency, "was not meant to open just any door. It opens something far more significant, something connected to the very heart of this mystery." I glanced back at the chest, still open and revealing the scattered papers that had once been carefully hidden away. Holmes had already sifted through many of the documents, his sharp eyes picking out fragments of coded messages, financial records, and cryptic references to a secret society that seemed to have operated within the tower's walls for centuries. It was all there, laid out before us, pieces of a puzzle too intricate for any but Holmes to decipher. But it was the key that held our attention now, its weight far more than its physical presence suggested. It was a key to a secret, one that could expose the truth behind Lady Catherine Montague's disappearance. And in that moment I understood. We were no longer merely investigating a missing person. We were on the cusp of uncovering something far darker, something that threatened the very foundations of the tower itself. Holmes turned away from the chest, holding the key up to the faint light from the torch on the wall. He studied it as though it were a living thing, searching for a hidden meaning in its shape, its wear, its very presence in the chest. After a long moment, he placed it carefully in his pocket and straightened. "We must move quickly, Watson," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "This key leads us to something that has been hidden for far too long, and I suspect that whoever went to such lengths to conceal it will not hesitate to stop us from finding it." His words echoed in my mind as we quickly gathered our things and prepared to leave the chamber. As we retraced our steps through the narrow corridors, the sense of urgency heightened with every turn. The deeper we went into the tower, the more the shadows seemed to grow, as though the very walls of the place were conspiring to keep its secrets buried. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and soon we reached a part of the tower I had never seen before, an area that seemed to be reserved for the most ancient and restricted parts of the fortress. It was here, I knew, that we would find the door the key opened. But as Holmes led the way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, one that had been set long before we ever arrived. We reached the door at the end of the hall. It was large, imposing, and covered in dust, as though it had not been opened in years. There was no symbol or engraving this time, only the blank, unyielding surface of the ancient wood. Holmes stood in front of it, holding the key in his hand, his brow furrowed as he examined the lock. I glanced at him, sensing the same unease that gripped me. "Holmes, do you think—" He held up a hand to silence me, his eyes focused entirely on the keyhole. There was no time for further questions, no room for doubt. He inserted the key into the lock, and with a soft click the door creaked open. The sound seemed to reverberate through the silence of the hall, as though the tower itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, its air thick with the smell of aged parchment and something older, something forgotten. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with books and scrolls that had not seen the light of day for centuries. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested a small wooden box. The box was plain, unremarkable, but there was something about it that felt out of place in the otherwise archaic surroundings. Holmes moved toward it without hesitation, his eyes never leaving the box. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he opened it, revealing a series of old papers and a small, intricately carved object, a figurine perhaps, though its true shape was obscured by the layers of dust and grime that had accumulated over the years. "This," Holmes murmured, his voice low, almost reverent, "is what Lady Montague was searching for. These papers, they document the final years of the tower's most secretive operations. And this figurine, it's a symbol of the very group that has been pulling the strings behind Lady Montague's disappearance." I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. The figurine, now illuminated by the faint light, looked like an ancient idol, its features worn and indistinct but unmistakably crafted with purpose. The papers, as Holmes had said, contained records of dealings and transactions, names, and dates that seemed to form a secret history of the tower itself. Holmes sifted through the papers, his eyes scanning each one with growing intensity. "The answers are here, Watson, and they point to something far more dangerous than we realized. The group behind Lady Montague's disappearance is not just some rogue faction. They have been embedded within the very heart of the British government, pulling strings for decades. The revelation hit me like a thunderclap. The tower, that ancient symbol of British history, was not merely a place of royal imprisonment. It was a symbol of something darker, more insidious. And the truth of Lady Catherine Montague's disappearance was intricately tied to this hidden network, a network that Holmes had just begun to unravel. "There is no turning back now," Holmes said quietly, closing the box with a decisive motion. "The game has changed, Watson, and we are about to face an enemy far more powerful than we could have imagined." The weight of Holmes's words hung heavily in the air, and for a brief moment I felt as though the ground beneath us might give way. The realization that Lady Montague's disappearance was part of something much larger, something hidden deep within the very walls of the tower, was a staggering one. As I stood in the quiet, dimly lit room, I couldn't help but think back to everything we had learned so far, the coded messages, the secretive society, and now the figurine that seemed to symbolize something far older and more dangerous than we had imagined. Holmes closed the wooden box with a soft thud, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't look up at me, his mind already several steps ahead as he processed the implications of what we had uncovered. I watched him carefully, knowing that whatever came next would set us on a course from which there would be no turning back. "We need to leave this room," Holmes said abruptly, his voice as sharp as ever. "There's nothing more to be gained here for now. What we have discovered points to a larger, far more intricate conspiracy, and I'm certain that we are not the only ones aware of it." I nodded, understanding that this was no longer a matter of solving a simple disappearance. It was a matter of unraveling a web of secrets that had been woven into the very fabric of British history. As we exited the chamber and made our way back through the winding corridors of the tower, the sense of urgency that had been present since we first entered the place only grew stronger. "Holmes," I said as we walked, "do you believe Helena Montague's suspicions about the involvement of a secret society? And what of the figurine? It can't just be a symbol. It must represent something significant, something tied directly to the people who have orchestrated this entire affair." Holmes's pace didn't falter, but his lips tightened slightly as he considered my words. "I do believe Lady Helena's fears are well-founded, Watson. The figurine is a key piece of a much larger puzzle. But there's more to it than that. This society, if it exists, has been operating in the shadows for centuries, hiding behind the guise of loyalty and patriotism. They have their hands in every corner of the empire, and Lady Catherine's investigation was likely an unintentional threat to them." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I imagined the scale of the conspiracy Holmes was alluding to. It wasn't just a single rogue faction we were up against. It was an entrenched network of power and influence, one that had survived the passage of time and remained hidden from the public eye. As we reached the tower's outer gates, I noticed the growing tension in Holmes's posture. He had gone from thoughtful contemplation to a state of quiet readiness, as if preparing himself for whatever might come next. I followed his gaze as he looked out across the courtyard, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "It's not enough to simply uncover the truth, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low. "We must be prepared for the consequences. Those who are behind this will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose their secrets. We are entering dangerous waters now." I knew he was right. It wasn't just about solving the case anymore. It was about survival. The powers we were up against were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that their operations remained hidden. But the thought of leaving the truth buried, of allowing this insidious force to continue its work unchecked, was intolerable to me. "Then what is our next move?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest. Holmes turned to me, his expression hardening with determination. "We need to track down those responsible, Watson. We've seen the first signs of their handiwork, but now we must dig deeper. There are still people in this city, powerful people who hold the answers we need. Our next step is to identify them, and then perhaps to confront them directly. I felt a jolt of apprehension. Holmes was a master of deduction, but even he could not predict the full extent of the danger we were about to face. We were no longer investigating a simple missing persons case. We were challenging the very structures of power that held this country in its grip. As we left the tower behind and entered the fog-laden streets of London, I couldn't shake the feeling that the net was slowly closing around us. The city, with its winding streets and shadowed corners, seemed to hold its breath as we moved through it, as if it too was aware of the peril that had entered its heart. Holmes, though, moved with purpose, his mind focused entirely on the path ahead. We made our way to a small, discreet tavern on the edge of the city, a place where Holmes had often found information in the past. It was the kind of place where people spoke freely, but only if you knew how to listen. Holmes had his sources, and I knew that tonight we would need every scrap of information he could glean. Inside, the tavern was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale ale and tobacco smoke. A fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the wooden beams. The chatter of patrons filled the room. But there was an edge to the atmosphere tonight, an unease that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. Holmes approached the bar and exchanged a few quiet words with the barkeep, a man whose face was lined with age, but whose eyes held a sharpness that came from years of listening to the secrets of London's underworld. Holmes passed him a coin, and the barkeep nodded, motioning toward a shadowed corner of the room. We made our way over, and a man rose from the table as we approached. He was thin, his clothes dark and unremarkable, but his eyes betrayed a deep wariness, as though he were always watching, always waiting for the next move. "Holmes," the man said, his voice low and cautious. "I was wondering when you'd come. It seems there's been more stirring in the tower than we realized." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his tone hardening. "Tell me everything you know, and be quick about it. We don't have much time." The man nodded and sat down, casting a quick glance around the room before leaning in. "There's a network," he began, "but it's not just here in London. It spreads through the entire empire. The Montagues, they've been a part of it for generations." The man's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. "The Montagues, they've been a part of it for generations." His voice dropped even lower, and he glanced over his shoulder once more, ensuring that no one was listening. The tavern, with its hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glass, seemed to close in on us as he leaned in further, his eyes darting nervously. Holmes's gaze never wavered. He had a way of making people feel as though the weight of the world rested on their next words. The stranger swallowed, then continued, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "They're not just some old aristocratic family," he said. "They were involved in something far darker, a society that has existed under the radar for centuries. They've worked in the shadows, influencing decisions, pulling strings, shaping history from behind closed doors. Lady Catherine, she was on the verge of exposing them. She was too close, and that's why they had to silence her." Holmes did not flinch, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the stranger's words. "You're saying the Montagues are part of a secret society that's been operating for generations, and Lady Catherine was about to uncover them. What was she investigating exactly? What did she find?" The man hesitated, as though the question itself were too dangerous to answer. "I don't know all the details, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but I've heard whispers. Rumors that they've been involved in the control of some of the highest offices in Britain. It's not just politics. They've had their hands in business, the military, even the royal family. They're everywhere, pulling strings. They don't want anyone to know who they really are." Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but I could sense the tension in him, the way his mind was already turning the stranger's words over, looking for the patterns and connections that might lead to the next crucial piece of the puzzle. "And what of this figurine?" Holmes asked, his tone sharp. "The one we found in the tower. Do you know what it represents?" The man stiffened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might retract into himself, retreating into the very shadows from which he had come. But then his shoulders slumped in resignation, and he exhaled sharply. "The figurine," he began, "it's more than just a trinket. It's a symbol, a marker of belonging. It's the mark of the society, a reminder of their power. I've heard it referred to as the Eye of the Empire, but it's not something you can find easily. Only a select few, those truly at the top, are ever allowed to hold it. The name struck a chord deep within me, and I looked at Holmes, trying to gauge his reaction. He, however, had already moved past the man's words, his mind racing through the possibilities. The Eye of the Empire, Holmes muttered. A fitting name for an organization that has been watching, manipulating, and controlling the course of history from the shadows. The figurine was a warning then. Lady Catherine had unearthed something they didn't want exposed, and she was getting too close. The man nodded, his face paling. That's why they had to act fast. She wasn't supposed to find out. And she wasn't supposed to be alive. But she is alive, I said, my voice firm despite the lingering uncertainty that clouded my thoughts. You believe she's been hidden, don't you? Locked away somewhere, maybe even within the tower itself? The stranger looked up at me, his expression tense. Yes, I do. But I don't know where. All I know is that when someone disappears like that, it's not just a case of being taken. It's a carefully orchestrated operation. And if you're going to find her, Mr. Holmes, you need to follow the money. That's where the answers are. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he processed this. The money, yes, of course. A society with such reach must have resources, accounts, properties, holdings that would lead us straight to them. But they won't make it easy. I felt a chill settle in my chest. Holmes had just confirmed what I had suspected all along. The stakes were higher than we had initially thought. We weren't just chasing a missing woman. We were uncovering a deep-seated conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Britain's most powerful institutions. The Montagues, a family that seemed harmless at first glance, were now revealed to be the key players in a shadowy organization that could shape the future of the empire itself. Holmes stood up abruptly, his decision made. We need to find the financial trail, Watson. The money will lead us to the Montagues, and from there to Lady Catherine. We cannot waste time. The stranger stood as well, his eyes darting nervously around the room. You'll have to be careful. They know you're onto them now. If you keep pushing, they'll start to watch you, too. You won't be safe. You'll need help. Holmes gave the man a pointed look. If I need help, I will ask for it. But I prefer to work alone. It's how I work best. The man nodded, his expression resigned. Then go quickly. The longer you wait, the less chance you'll have of getting out of this alive. Without another word, Holmes turned and headed for the door, signaling for me to follow. The fog outside had thickened, and the streets were quieter now, as though the city itself had retreated into a hushed state of anticipation. I could feel the weight of our mission pressing down on me, but it was nothing compared to the resolve in Holmes's step. As we moved swiftly through the streets, I couldn't help but think of Lady Catherine, hidden somewhere in the heart of the tower, perhaps even close by. What had she uncovered that was so dangerous? And more importantly, who else would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth remained buried? Holmes didn't speak as we walked. He was focused, his mind locked on the next step in the investigation. I, however, couldn't shake the growing sense of foreboding that gnawed at me. We were on the verge of something monumental, something that would change everything. But with each passing moment, I wondered whether we were getting closer to the truth, or to the point of no return. The city seemed to pulse with a quiet menace as Holmes and I navigated the fog-laden streets, our footsteps muffled by the thick mist that clung to the cobblestones. It was a city that hid secrets in its shadows, a place where the streets twisted and turned like the intricate designs of a puzzle. The further we ventured, the more I felt the weight of the conspiracy closing in around us. We were not merely chasing a missing person anymore. We were following a trail that could lead us to the heart of a web of power, deception, and dark history. Holmes's face remained inscrutable as we walked, his eyes scanning the streets, alert to every detail. I could see the gears turning in his mind, each step forward bringing him closer to an answer, but also closer to the danger that now surrounded us. The stranger in the tavern had spoken of the financial trail, the money that would lead us to the Montagues. It made sense. Those who operated in the shadows often did so with vast resources at their disposal. Follow the money and it would lead us to the heart of the conspiracy. Holmes, I said, breaking the silence, where do we begin? Holmes glanced at me, his expression unchanged. We start by finding out where the Montagues have invested their wealth. They may have hidden it well, but every empire, no matter how well disguised, leaves behind traces, patterns in the financial records, Assets that can't be erased so easily. I nodded, though the thought of delving into the financial dealings of such a powerful family was daunting. It wasn't just about money. It was about the reach of the Montagues' influence. If they truly had their hands in every corner of British society, uncovering their financial dealings might reveal far more than just Lady Catherine's disappearance. It might expose a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Holmes led us to a discreet building on a narrow street, tucked away from the bustling crowds. It was a place that looked ordinary enough, a stone building with a faded sign above the door, barely visible in the fog. Holmes didn't hesitate, pushing open the door with a swift motion. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and serious, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. It was a bank of sorts, though not one I had ever heard of, small, private, and seemingly inconspicuous. "We'll need access to their records," Holmes muttered as he scanned the room. "The bank's ledgers will tell us everything we need to know." The clerk behind the counter looked up as we entered, but before he could speak, Holmes had already approached him with a confident air. "Good evening," Holmes said smoothly. "I require access to certain records. I'm investigating the financial dealings of a private client, and I believe you may be able to assist." The clerk hesitated, clearly unsure of Holmes's credentials, but Holmes's gaze remained unwavering. "I assure you this is a matter of utmost importance. It would be in your best interest to cooperate." There was a long pause, but after a few moments the clerk stood and motioned for us to follow him. "Very well, Mr. Holmes," he said reluctantly, "but you must understand, these records are not easily accessed. You'll need to have the proper authorization." Holmes gave him a pointed look. "I'll have what I need." "Don't worry about that." The clerk led us to a back room dimly lit, where the bank's ledgers were stored. As the clerk unlocked a large metal cabinet, Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the room, quickly taking in the layout and memorizing the arrangement of files. There was no doubt in my mind that he had already formed a plan in his mind. The question was, how far would we be allowed to go before the walls closed in? "Thank you," Holmes said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'll need to look through the records from the last 2 decades. The Montagues, specifically." The clerk hesitated but nodded, reluctantly pulling the files from the shelves and placing them on the table in front of Holmes. The sound of pages turning echoed in the room as Holmes meticulously scanned the financial documents, his eyes darting over figures, dates, and names with astonishing speed. I stood by watching as Holmes worked. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence only broken by the occasional rustling of paper. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. We were this close to uncovering the truth, and yet I could sense that we were also on the precipice of something far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. He pointed to a series of transactions on one of the ledgers. "This is where it begins." I leaned over to examine the records he had marked. The transactions were large, involving sums of money that would be enough to influence entire industries. But there was more than just money here. Names, places, codes that didn't quite make sense. "These are not just investments," I said. "These are purchases. Properties, perhaps? And look at the dates. The transactions occurred just before Lady Catherine's disappearance." Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Exactly. This is the moment the Montagues began to cover their tracks. They've bought up assets in different parts of the empire, disguising them as legitimate investments. But what they're really doing is consolidating power. These purchases aren't just about money. They're about control. I could see it now. The Montagues had been preparing for something, setting the stage for a larger play. The transactions were too deliberate, too calculated to be random. They had been building an empire within the empire, and Lady Catherine had stumbled upon it. But what were they preparing for? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the final pages of the ledger with increased intensity. I could sense that he was reaching the heart of it, the moment where everything would become clear. And then, as if on cue, he stopped. His finger rested on a final obscure entry, an encrypted code that stood out from the rest. Holmes leaned back, a rare smile touching his lips. "This, Watson, is the key, the last piece of the puzzle." I stepped closer, my heart racing. "What does it mean?" "It's a map," Holmes said quietly. "A map to their most secretive holdings. And it's where we will find Lady Catherine Montague. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. We were about to uncover the heart of the conspiracy. But as Holmes folded the ledger carefully, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. Holmes carefully closed the ledger, his fingers lingering over the map-like entry that had brought everything into sharper focus. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as though the very walls of the bank were closing in on us. The realization was undeniable. We were on the verge of something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. The Montagues had not just been hiding their wealth. They had been constructing a network, an intricate shadowed web designed to control far more than mere business interests. I glanced at Holmes, who had already risen from his seat, a determined look on his face. His mind was moving quickly, no doubt formulating a plan, but there was something in his demeanor that told me he was aware of the risks ahead, risks that I, in my growing anxiety, had only begun to comprehend. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady despite the tension that gripped the room, "we've uncovered their map, but this is just the beginning. The Montagues have made their move, and they won't allow us to reach Lady Catherine without a fight." I nodded, still processing the significance of the map. It was a literal key, a representation of the hidden assets, the secretive holdings that the Montagues had secured over the years. Each location on the map was marked with cryptic symbols, and I could feel the weight of what it represented. These weren't just investments or acquisitions. They were places of power, hidden strongholds of influence and control, woven throughout the empire. Lady Catherine had been investigating these very locations, but the Montagues had been preparing for this moment. "We need to move quickly," Holmes continued. "There's no telling how much longer we have before they realize their secret has been exposed. We'll follow this map, but we must be careful. The Montagues have eyes everywhere. The moment we begin to dig deeper, they'll stop at nothing to ensure that we fail." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach at the thought of what lay ahead. It wasn't just a matter of finding Lady Catherine anymore. We were stepping into a dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than either of us had initially understood. The power and reach of the Montagues stretched far beyond what I had imagined. Holmes's gaze flicked to the door, and I saw the familiar spark of determination in his eyes. He had already made up his mind. "We're going to need allies," he said, his voice low. "But not just anyone. We need someone who has access to the same circles the Montagues operate in, someone who knows the true extent of their power." I met his eyes, a sense of unease creeping into my chest. "Who do you have in mind?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "There's one person who can provide us with the information we need, someone who has dealt with the Montagues before and survived to tell the tale." Before I could ask any further questions, Holmes was already moving toward the door, the familiar pace of his steps echoing through the room. I followed, my thoughts racing, trying to piece together everything we had learned. We made our way back into the fog-laden streets of London, the city's looming buildings shrouded in mystery, as we moved swiftly through the dimming light. The map, now carefully folded in Holmes's coat pocket, was our guide, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, one set long before we had even realized the true scale of the danger. I glanced over at Holmes, who seemed unfazed by the weight of the unknown. His mind was always several steps ahead, but I couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding that lingered in the air. We arrived at an unassuming townhouse, tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The building was nondescript, its windows curtained and its door plain. Holmes knocked 3 times, sharp, deliberate knocks that seemed to hold a rhythm I couldn't decipher. After a brief pause, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his mid-40s, his face hard and weathered by years of experience. "Holmes," the man said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable note of respect. "I had a feeling you'd be the one to come knocking." "This is Watson," Holmes said, gesturing for me to step forward. "We need your help, Jan." The man eyed me for a moment, his gaze calculating. "And what help would that be?" "We're after information on the Montagues," Holmes replied without hesitation. "We've uncovered something dangerous, and we need to know more about their operations, specifically their financial dealings and the hidden assets they control." Ian's expression darkened. "The Montagues," he muttered, as if tasting the name with distaste. "You've stumbled into something far worse than you realize, Holmes. Those people have been playing this game for generations. They've got influence over governments, businesses, everything. But you're right to come to me. I know how they operate. I've seen it firsthand. Holmes stepped closer, his tone becoming more serious. We need to move quickly. The Montagues are about to close their net, and we can't afford to wait any longer. I trust you, Ian. Can you help us? The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. I can, but it won't be easy. They have their hands in every corner of the city. Getting to their records won't be a walk in the park, but I can point you in the right direction. Good, Holmes said, his voice firm. We don't have much time. Ian led us into the townhouse, and as the door closed behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that we had finally reached the heart of the conspiracy. Everything we had discovered so far had been a slow unraveling, but now it felt as though we were about to uncover the true scope of the Montagues' power. Ian sat at a small desk in the corner of the room, pulling out a series of maps and financial records that seemed to date back years. As he spread them out, I realized just how far-reaching the Montagues' influence was. They weren't just controlling businesses or wealth. They were pulling the strings behind the scenes, shaping policies, decisions, and even lives. This is where you need to look, Ian said, pointing to a series of marked locations on the map. They've hidden their most valuable assets here, places you wouldn't even think to look. But if you follow these leads, you'll get closer to the truth. Holmes leaned over the maps, his eyes scanning every detail. Thank you, Ian. You've done more than we could have hoped. Ian gave a grim smile. Just be careful, Holmes. The Montagues won't take kindly to this. They'll come for you, just as they've come for others. As we left Ian's townhouse and stepped back into the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something far greater than we had anticipated. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and I knew deep down that the moment we followed these leads, there would be no turning back. The streets of London seemed even more foreboding as Holmes and I walked back to our lodging, the weight of our next steps pressing down on us. I couldn't shake the sense that we were being drawn deeper into something we were no longer prepared to handle. The Montagues, with their sprawling influence and hidden network, were far more than just a powerful family. They were the architects of a system that operated under the very surface of society. And now we were chasing their shadows, tracing the faintest threads of evidence in a world designed to keep us blind. Holmes, however, seemed unfazed. His mind was a labyrinth of logic and deduction, each new piece of the puzzle fitting into place with precision. He had a plan, one I was certain would lead us to Lady Catherine, but the path to her was dark and the dangers that lay ahead were becoming ever clearer. The stakes had escalated. This was no longer a matter of finding a missing person. It was a race to expose the hidden mechanisms of power that threatened to upend everything. We had left Ian's townhouse with new information, a series of marked locations that seemed to be the Montagues' hidden assets, locations tied to their deepest operations. They were places of significance, scattered across London and beyond, unassuming in appearance but with their own dark purpose. I knew that following these leads would take us closer to the heart of the Montagues' empire, but I also knew it would make us targets. They would not take kindly to the scrutiny we were about to bring upon them. As we arrived at our lodging, Holmes paused for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the area. It was a simple building, tucked away from the main thoroughfare, but even here, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a chill running down my spine. Holmes must have felt it too, for he turned to me with a flicker of concern in his gaze. "I don't like this, Watson," he murmured. "We need to be careful. I sense we are being followed." I glanced around, my heart racing as I looked for any sign of movement, but the street was quiet, save for a few pedestrians going about their business. "Are you sure?" Holmes nodded, his hand slipping into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the map we had obtained from Ian. "There's a pattern to their movements. If we're being watched, it's not by chance. Someone is keeping tabs on us." I took a steadying breath. Holmes's instincts were rarely wrong, and I knew better than to dismiss his concerns. "Then what do we do?" "We move quickly," he replied. "We cannot afford to linger. The next step is to visit these locations, but we must do so carefully. We'll follow the trail, but we'll also need to cover our tracks. We'll need to disappear for a time." I wasn't entirely sure what Holmes had in mind, but his words filled me with a sense of urgency. We had to stay ahead of the Montagues, But their reach was long, and their methods, as we had already seen, were far from conventional. They were accustomed to operating in the shadows, and now as we began to shine a light on their operations, we had become a threat. Holmes gathered a few of his belongings, placing the map in his coat pocket and securing it carefully. I did the same, ensuring we weren't carrying anything that might give away our plans. As we prepared to leave, Holmes turned to me, his eyes cold and focused. "We'll take the back routes," he said, his voice low. "And we'll move in pairs. We can't risk being seen together at this stage. Stay close, but not too close. Don't draw attention." I nodded, already slipping into the mode of caution that Holmes had instilled in me over the years. The chase was on, but now it felt as though we were the ones being hunted. We left our lodging and set off through the winding back streets of London, our steps light but purposeful. Holmes led the way, always watching, always calculating. The city was a maze, but to him it was a puzzle, a network of connections waiting to be deciphered. I couldn't help but marvel at how easily he moved through the shadows, his every step designed to keep us one step ahead. We visited the first marked location on the map, a small, seemingly innocuous building tucked between two larger structures. It was a warehouse, nothing more, but Holmes had already deduced that it wasn't the building itself that mattered. It was the activity within it. We circled the building, peering through the cracks in the walls, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The windows were boarded up and the door was locked tight. Holmes studied the exterior for a long moment before speaking. "This place is a front, but the real operation lies deeper. We need to get inside." I looked at him, uncertain. "How do you propose we do that without alerting anyone?" Holmes's smile was small but confident. "Trust me, Watson. I have my ways. I didn't question him, not now." I followed him as he moved to the side of the building, his hands working quickly to find an entrance. After a few moments, he slipped a small tool from his coat pocket and began working at the door's lock. We waited in tense silence. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Holmes motioned for me to follow, and I did, stepping into the dimly lit interior. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating. There were crates stacked haphazardly against the walls, some labeled with names that meant little to me, others completely unmarked. Holmes moved swiftly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room, his mind already on the next step. We found what we were looking for within minutes, a set of ledgers hidden in a locked drawer in the back office. Holmes wasted no time, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. The records were meticulous, chronicling shipments, payments, and transfers. Nothing overtly criminal, but the connections were there. Each entry tied to a name or place, each transaction marking the flow of money from one location to another. Holmes's finger hovered over one of the entries. "This is it, Watson," he murmured. "The final piece. The Montagues are laundering money through their legitimate businesses, and these ledgers are the key to tracing it back to them." I felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the nagging thought that we were walking ever closer to the heart of the danger. "And this will lead us to Lady Catherine." Holmes didn't answer right away. He continued scanning the records, his mind racing. "Yes, but it will also lead us to them. And once we have everything we need, the Montagues will stop at nothing to protect their empire." The realization hit me hard. We had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The path to Lady Catherine Montague's disappearance had twisted and turned through every corner of London, a labyrinth of deception and power. But now, as we stood at the precipice of the final revelation, everything seemed to fall into place with chilling clarity. Holmes had always been a man of intellect, but the gravity of what we were about to uncover weighed heavily on both of us. Holmes turned to me, the ledger in hand, his expression as unreadable as ever. The records we had discovered in the warehouse had provided the last pieces of the puzzle. The money trail led directly to the Montagues' most powerful allies, those in high places, with the means and the motive to conceal the truth. But it wasn't just wealth they were protecting, it was control. The empire they had built in the shadows was vast, and Lady Catherine had been the only one brave enough to shine a light on it. "We have the answers." "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice filled with a rare note of finality, "but the danger is far from over. The Montagues will never allow us to walk away from this." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. I knew that whatever happened next, There would be no turning back. The Montagues, with their reach extending into the highest echelons of society, would not hesitate to silence us if we got too close to their secrets. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at me. Holmes's eyes flickered with determination. "We confront them. It's time we force the truth into the open, no matter the cost." Our first stop was the location we had pinpointed in the ledgers, the last hidden asset in the Montagues' sprawling network. It was a mansion on the outskirts of London, far removed from the eyes of the public. Holmes had deduced that this was where Lady Catherine was being kept, where her investigation had led her before she was silenced. The Montagues had underestimated her, believing she could be contained. But now, with the final pieces of the puzzle in our hands, Holmes was determined to expose everything. As we approached the mansion, the fog thickened, cloaking the building in an eerie, oppressive silence. We knew we were being watched. It was only a matter of time before the Montagues realized their secret had been unearthed. The mansion loomed ahead, dark windows like eyes staring out into the night. Holmes moved swiftly, his steps quiet and deliberate. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding in my chest as we made our way through the overgrown garden and toward a side entrance Holmes had already scoped out. The tension was palpable, each moment stretching out like an eternity. The air felt thick with danger, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against us. We entered the mansion with the ease of men who knew the stakes were higher than ever. Holmes led me down narrow corridors, each turn bringing us closer to our goal. At the end of a long hallway, we came upon a door, heavily guarded but unguarded in the way that only the truly confident can afford to be. Holmes didn't hesitate. With a quick motion, he picked the lock and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but there was no mistaking the figure sitting quietly by the window. Lady Catherine Montague. She was alive, though the years of isolation had taken their toll on her. Her eyes were sharp, her posture regal even in the confines of the room. But as she looked at us, I saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a mixture of hope and fear. "You found me," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I didn't think anyone would. Holmes's face softened, a rare expression of sympathy crossing his features. "You were right to keep searching, Lady Montague. We've uncovered everything." She looked at him for a moment as though weighing his words. "And what now? Will they let me go? Will they let all of us go?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "They won't. They'll do everything in their power to bury this, everything in their power to protect their empire." Lady Catherine rose slowly, her movements graceful but weary. "Then we must act quickly. They've already tried to silence me once. But it seems I've underestimated you, Mr. Holmes, you and your friend." "Time is of the essence," Holmes replied. "We need to expose the Montagues. Their power lies in their secrecy. Once we reveal them, the game will change." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and I turned to see a figure approaching. The last person I expected to see. Captain Aldridge. Holmes and I both tensed, but Aldridge's expression was not one of hostility. Instead, he looked weary, almost resigned. "You've done it," he said, his voice low. "You've uncovered their empire. What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight with suspicion. Aldridge sighed, his face shadowed with regret. "I've been one of them, Watson. I was part of the network. The Montagues had me in their pocket, just like so many others. But I never knew the full extent of what they were doing. When I saw Lady Catherine start to unravel it, I couldn't let them silence her." Holmes's eyes flicked to Aldridge, his expression unreadable. "Then help us. Help us bring this to an end." Aldridge hesitated, then nodded. "It's not that simple. The Montagues won't go down quietly. They've already made arrangements to leave the country, to disappear. We're running out of time." "We're not running," Holmes replied, his voice sharp with determination. "We'll expose them, Aldridge. We'll make sure they can't hide anymore. With Aldridge's help, we were able to gather the final pieces of evidence, documents, connections, and testimonies from others who had been part of the Montagues' web of influence. We took the information to the authorities, ensuring that the truth would be made public, that their empire would be brought to its knees. The Montagues were powerful, but they were not invincible. In the end, their secrets were laid bare, their control over the empire shattered. The network they had built in the shadows collapsed, and Lady Catherine Montague was free. As for Holmes and me, we returned to our usual routine, but something had changed. The case had been solved, but the shadow of the Montagues' empire lingered in our minds, a reminder of the quiet power that can shape the world from behind closed doors. The investigation had ended, but the lessons learned would stay with us forever, and as Holmes settled back into his chair, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of curiosity, I knew that, as always, the game was never truly over. There would always be another mystery to solve, another truth to uncover.